Sometimes a man's whole life can change with something the world threw away. Eli Mercer was once a respected cattleman, a man people looked up to. Now he's just a poor cowboy with a stubborn donkey and a heart full of questions. When Eli drags a rusty, bullet-scarred safe from a ghost town back home, everyone laughs. Another fool's errand. But that safe holds secrets from 40 years ago, from the robbery that orphaned him as a boy. Inside there's no gold. Just old letters, a torn photograph, and a journal naming names. One name makes his blood run cold. Someone he's known his whole life. Someone still living in town. What happens when the truth finally comes to light? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun broke over Stillwater like it had for 1,000 mornings before, painting the dusty main street in shades of amber and gold. Eli Mercer stood in the doorway of the old barn he called home, a tin cup of weak coffee steaming in his weathered hands. The barn wasn't much, just 4 walls and a roof that leaked when it rained hard, but it was his, paid for with the last of his savings 3 years back when everything else had fallen apart. Clementine brayed from her stall, impatient for breakfast. Eli smiled despite himself. That donkey had more personality than half the people in town, and twice the loyalty. He set down his coffee and grabbed a handful of oats from the near-empty sack in the corner. His fingers traced the worn leather of her bridle hanging on a nail by the stall, the same bridle he'd used 15 years ago when he had a string of horses and a ranch that stretched across 3 valleys. Back when people called him Mr. Mercer and tipped their hats with respect instead of pity. "Morning, girl," he said softly, stroking Clementine's grey muzzle as she munched contentedly. "You and me, we're going to take a ride out to Crossroads today. See what treasures the desert's been hiding." Clementine's ears twitched. She knew that word, Crossroads. The ghost town 20 miles east, where Eli spent his days digging through ruins and dragging home whatever caught his eye. Broken wagon wheels, rusted tools, once an entire rocking chair that just needed a little glue. The townspeople called it junk. Eli called it history. Every piece told a story, and stories were all he had left. He finished his coffee and dressed in his usual clothes, canvas trousers worn thin at the knees, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest that had seen better decades. His hat, at least, still held its shape, though the brim was curled from too many rainstorms. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror by the door and saw what everyone else saw. A man in his 50s who'd let life beat him down. His face was lined and sun-darkened, his dark hair streaked with grey. But his eyes still held something. A question, a hunger for answers that had burned in him since he was 6 years old. The walk to town was short, just half a mile down a dirt path that wound between scrub brush and stubborn cacti. Stillwater wasn't big. Maybe 300 souls if you counted the families on the outlying ranches. One main street with a general store, a boarding house, a saloon, a blacksmith, and the sheriff's office. The church sat on a small hill at the north end, its white paint peeling, but its bell still ringing every Sunday morning. As Eli led Clementine down Main Street, he nodded to the folks he passed. Most nodded back, though their eyes slid away quickly. There was Mrs. Patterson carrying a basket of laundry, young Billy Henderson sweeping the walkway in front of his father's store, old Timothy Moss sitting on his usual bench whittling away at a piece of pine. They were kind enough, most of them. They just didn't know what to say to a man who'd lost everything. The general store's bell chimed as Eli pushed through the door. The smell hit him immediately. Coffee, tobacco, leather, and the faint sweetness of penny candy in glass jars. Jesse was behind the counter, stacking cans of beans with careful precision. The boy looked up, and his whole face brightened. Mr. Mercer. Jesse was 14, all gangly limbs and earnest energy. His parents had died of fever 2 winters back, and he'd been working for the Hendersons ever since, sleeping in a small room above the store. Eli saw himself in that boy, another orphan trying to make sense of a world that had taken too much too soon. "Morning, Jesse." Eli approached the counter, pulling a short list from his pocket. Need some supplies. Jerky, hardtack, a length of rope if you've got it. Going out to Crossroads again?" Jesse's eyes lit with curiosity. The boy loved hearing about Eli's expeditions, treating each trip like an adventure from a dime novel. "That's right. Thought I might find something interesting this time." "You always find something interesting," Jesse said, gathering the items. "Remember that compass?" "Still works perfect," Eli smiled. He'd given the compass to Jesse last month, a silver piece he'd cleaned and polished until it shone. The boy treasured it like gold. "You keep that safe now. A good compass can save your life." As Jesse wrapped the supplies in brown paper, the store's front door opened again. Eli didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The heavy footsteps and the smell of expensive tobacco told him everything. Tom Brennan, the man who now owned the ranch that had once been Eli's pride and joy. "Well, well," Brennan's voice was smooth as snake oil. "If it isn't our local treasure hunter. Found any more junk to clutter up that barn of yours, Mercer?" Eli turned slowly. Tom Brennan was a big man, not just in size, but in presence. He wore fine clothes, a tailored jacket, polished boots, a gold watch chain glinting at his vest. His face was florid and well-fed, his mustache waxed to sharp points. He'd come to Stillwater 10 years ago with money from back east and had been buying up land ever since. When Eli's ranch had failed, when the drought killed his. Cattle and the bank called in his loans. Brennan had been there with cash in hand and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, just looking. "For what others have left behind," Eli said evenly. "No harm in that." "No harm at all," Brennan agreed, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just seems a man of your years might want to spend his time more productively. There's work to be had if you weren't so proud. I could always use another hand on the ranch." "Your old ranch, as it happens." The offer hung in the air like rotting meat. Eli had heard it before. Brennan seemed to take particular pleasure in dangling it. The chance for Eli to work on the land he'd once owned, to take orders from the man who'd bought his dreams at auction. "Appreciate the offer," Eli said, keeping his voice neutral. "But I'm doing fine as I am." Brennan chuckled, a sound without warmth. "Suit yourself. Just remember, pride's a cold companion when winter comes." He tipped his hat mockingly and strode out, leaving the smell of his tobacco behind. Jesse handed over the wrapped supplies, his young face troubled. "I don't like that man, Mr. Mercer. He's just what he is. And Jesse can't fault a snake for having fangs." Eli paid with the few coins he had, money earned from odd jobs and the occasional sale of something he'd restored. "You take care of yourself, son. I'll be back tomorrow." The ride out to Crossroads took most of the morning. Clementine plodded along at her steady pace while Eli let his mind wander. He always felt more at peace out here in the open desert, away from the weight of people's expectations and judgments. The sky stretched forever, deep blue and cloudless. Hawks circled on thermal currents. The only sounds were the wind, Clementine's hooves on the packed earth, and the creak of leather. Crossroads had been a thriving way station once. Back in the 1830s and 40s, the main stagecoach route had run right through it, carrying mail, passengers, and payroll for the mining operations to the north. Then came the fire. The stories varied depending on who told them, but everyone agreed on the basics. There'd been a robbery, a violent one. The stagecoach depot had burned to the ground. People had died, and the money, a substantial payroll, had never been recovered. That fire had happened in 1843. Eli had been born in 1837, which meant he'd been 6 years old when it happened. And he'd been there. His parents had run a small trading post adjacent to the depot. He had vague memories, more like fragments of nightmares, of flames and shouting and being carried away by someone he didn't recognize. By the time anyone thought to explain things to him properly, his parents were already buried, and he was living with the first of several families who'd taken him in out of Christian charity. No one had ever been arrested for the robbery. No one had ever found the money. And Eli had spent most of his life trying not to think about it, trying to build something new instead of dwelling on what had been taken. But lately, especially since he'd lost the ranch, the old questions had come back stronger than ever. Who had killed his parents? Why? And what really happened that night? Crossroads appeared on the horizon like a fever dream. Scattered buildings in various states of collapse, their wood bleached grey by decades of sun. The old depot was just a foundation now, blackened stones marking where walls had once stood. Eli guided Clementine through the ruins, his eyes scanning for anything worth salvaging. He'd been here dozens of times, but the desert had a way of revealing new things. Wind and sand shifted constantly, uncovering what had been buried. He dismounted near what had once been the depot's strong room, a stone structure separate from the main building. Most of the roof had caved in years ago, but the walls still stood, scarred with bullet holes. Eli had explored it before, but never thoroughly. Today, something drew him back. He stepped carefully through the rubble, his boots crunching on broken glass and charred wood. The interior was dim, lit only by sunlight streaming through gaps in the collapsed roof. And there, half buried under fallen beams and 40 years of accumulated debris, he saw it. A safe, iron maybe 3 feet tall, pitted with rust and age. And bullet scars, dozens of them, like someone had tried to shoot it open. His heart began to pound. This was the depot safe. It had to be. This was where the payroll would have been kept. Eli worked for over an hour, clearing debris and digging around the safe with his bare hands. It was heavy, too heavy to lift, but he'd brought rope. With Clementine's help and a lot of sweat, he managed to rig a harness and drag it free. The metal screeched against stone, protesting every inch. By the time he got it loaded onto the makeshift travois he'd fashioned from old boards, the sun was past its peak. The journey back to Stillwater would take until evening. But Eli didn't care. His hands trembled slightly as he tied down his prize. 40 years this safe had waited. And whatever was inside, whether gold or dust or nothing at all, it was the closest he'd ever come to answers. He looked back at the ruins of Crossroads one more time, at the foundation of the trading post where his parents had died. "I'm going to figure it out," he said quietly to the ghosts. "I promise you that." Then he urged Clementine forward, and they began the long journey home, pulling behind them the weight of history and the possibility of truth. The sun was setting when Eli and Clementine reached the edge of Stillwater, trailing the safe behind them like a prisoner in chains. The travois scraped and bounced over the uneven ground, raising small clouds of dust that turned gold in the fading light. Eli's back ached, and his hands were raw from managing the ropes, but there was a fire in his chest that had nothing to do with physical strain. This was it. This was the moment he'd been waiting for his entire adult life without quite knowing it. Main Street was busier than usual for a late afternoon. Seemed like half the town was out. Folks finishing their errands before supper, men gathering outside the saloon, children playing in the last of the daylight. And every single one of them stopped to stare as Eli made his slow, dusty procession down the street. The reaction was immediate and predictable. First came the looks of surprise, then the whispers, then the laughter. Eli kept his eyes forward and his jaw set, but he heard every word. "What in heaven's name is that?" "Looks like old Mercer's finally lost his mind." "That's a safe, ain't it? Rusted to hell and back, probably empty. Everything he brings back is worthless." The worst part wasn't the strangers, it was the people he knew. Mrs. Patterson shook her head sadly, the way you'd look at a sick dog. Timothy Moss called out from his bench, "Better luck next time, Eli," with false cheerfulness that stung worse than any insult. Even young Billy Henderson stared from the store window with wide eyes that held more pity than admiration. Tom Brennan was standing outside the saloon with a group of his ranch hands, a whiskey glass in one hand and a cigar in the other. When he saw Eli, his face split into a broad grin that showed all his teeth. "Well, I'll be," Brennan said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "Mercer's outdone himself this time. That's not junk, that's a genuine piece of scrap metal. Must have taken real effort to drag that all the way from wherever you found it." His men laughed on cue. Eli felt heat rise in his face, but forced it down. He wouldn't give Brennan the satisfaction. "It's from the old depot at Crossroads," Eli said evenly, stopping Clementine in the middle of the street. "The one that burned in 43. Brennan's smile didn't falter, but something flickered in his eyes. quick as lightning, gone before you could be sure you'd seen it. The depot, you say? Well, that makes it historical, I suppose. Still looks like junk to me. He took a long drag on his cigar. You planning to sell it for scrap? Might get $1 or two. Planning to open it, Eli said. This brought a fresh round of laughter from the gathering crowd. Someone called out, "Good luck with that." "Thing's probably rusted shut," another voice added. "Even if you get it open, it'll be empty." Anyone with sense would have cracked it open 40 years ago. Sheriff Hollis emerged from his office, drawn by the commotion. He was a solid man in his late 60s, grey-bearded and stern-faced, but fair in his judgments. He'd been sheriff for near 30 years, which meant he'd been in his prime when the depot burned. He walked up to the safe, circling it slowly, his expression unreadable. "That's depot property," he said finally. "From the robbery." "Yes, sir," Eli confirmed. "Found it in the strong-room ruins. Figured it's been abandoned long enough to count as salvage." Hollis nodded slowly. "Legally speaking, you're probably right. Depot Company went bankrupt years ago, and the land's federal now. Unclaimed property." He looked at Eli with those sharp grey eyes. "You really think there's something inside?" "Don't know," Eli admitted, "but it came from the place where my parents died." "Figure I've got a right to look." The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "Can't argue with that. But Mercer," he lowered his voice, though people were still listening, "don't get your hopes up. That robbery was investigated 6 ways from Sunday back in the day. If there'd been anything to find, someone would have found it. Maybe," Eli said. "Or maybe nobody looked hard enough." Hollis sighed and stepped back. "It's your time to waste. Just keep the peace while you're wasting it." He tipped his hat and returned to his office, ending the official part of the conversation. But the crowd wasn't done. Brennan pushed forward, his smile now edged with something sharper. "You know what I think, Mercer? I think you're chasing ghosts. You've been doing it for years, picking through ruins, collecting other people's leavings. It's sad, really. A man your age should be thinking about his legacy, not digging up the past." Eli met his gaze steadily. "My legacy is my business." "Is it?" Brennan stepped closer, and Eli caught the smell of expensive whiskey on his breath. "Because it seems to me you're making a spectacle of yourself. Again, you were somebody once, I'll grant you that. But now," he gestured at the safe, at Clementine, at Eli's worn clothes. "Now you're just a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when a man doesn't know when to quit." The street had gone quiet. Everyone was watching, waiting to see how Eli would respond. Part of him, the part that remembered being respected, being successful, wanted to knock that smug smile off Brennan's face. But the wiser part, the part that had learned patience through loss, stayed his hand. "I appreciate your concern," Eli said softly. "But I'm not quit yet." He clicked his tongue, and Clementine started moving again, pulling the safe toward the barn at the edge of town. Behind him, the crowd dispersed slowly, their conversations resuming with fresh gossip to chew on. Eli Mercer and his rusty safe. Another fool's errand from a man who couldn't let go of the past. By the time Eli got the safe into his barn and unhitched Clementine, full dark had fallen. He lit an oil lamp and stood staring at his prize. In the flickering light, the bullet scars looked even more ominous. Someone had wanted this safe open badly enough to shoot it. That meant something inside was worth protecting or worth stealing. He ran his hands over the cool metal, tracing the outline of the lock mechanism. It was old-fashioned, complicated. He'd need tools, time, and patience. But he had all three. Well, maybe not patience, not with 40 years of questions burning in his gut. But he'd find it somehow. A soft knock at the barn door made him turn. Jessie stood there, holding a basket covered with a cloth. "Miss Martha sent supper," the boy said. "Beef stew and cornbread. She said you'd probably forget to eat." Martha Hayes owned the boarding house, and she had a kind heart that she tried to hide behind practical gruffness. Eli smiled and took the basket. "Tell her I'm grateful." Jessie lingered, eyeing the safe with unconcealed curiosity. "Is it true what they're saying? That it's from the robbery where your folks died?" "It's true. And you're going to open it?" "Going to try?" Jessie stepped closer, his young face serious in the lamplight. "Mr. Mercer, what if—" He hesitated. "What if there's nothing inside? What if people are right and it's empty? Eli considered the question. It was the same one he'd been asking himself all day, if he was honest. What if this was just another dead end? Another piece of the past that yielded no answers. But then he thought about his parents, about the fragments of memory that haunted his dreams, about the questions that had shaped his entire life. Then, at least I'll know, he said finally. Sometimes knowing for certain is better than wondering forever. Jesse nodded slowly, seeming to understand. I think you're brave, he said quietly. Not foolish, like some folks say. Brave. After the boy left, Eli sat on an old crate and ate Martha's stew. It was good, rich and warming, but he barely tasted it. His eyes kept returning to the safe. Tomorrow, he'd start working on it in earnest. He'd brought tools and persistence. One way or another, he'd crack it open, and when he did, whatever lay inside would finally start giving him the answers he'd spent a lifetime seeking. Or it would prove everyone right, and he'd be left with nothing but rust and disappointment. Either way, at least he'd know. The next 3 days passed in a blur of effort and frustration. Eli worked on the safe from dawn until his lamp oil ran out each night, trying every trick he knew and inventing a few new ones. He borrowed a drill from the blacksmith, traded 2 days of labor for a set of lockpicks from a traveling tinker, and spent hours studying the mechanism by lamplight. Trying to understand its inner workings, the safe fought him at every turn. The lock was corroded, the metal warped from heat damage that must have come from the fire. Twice he thought he'd made progress, feeling tumblers shift inside only to have everything jam again. His fingers were covered in small cuts and rust stains. His back ached from hunching over the stubborn iron box, but he kept at it with the kind of focused determination that came from knowing this might be his last chance at answers. Jesse stopped by each evening after finishing his work at the store, bringing food from Martha and staying to watch Eli work. The boy asked questions, good ones, about how locks functioned and what might be causing the mechanism to stick. Eli appreciated the company. It kept him from disappearing too far into his own head, from the dark places where memories and speculation tangled together. On the 3rd evening, as Eli was attempting to file down a piece of the lock housing that seemed to be binding the main mechanism, Sheriff Hollis appeared at the barn door. He stood there for a moment, just watching, before clearing his throat. Evening, Mercer. Eli straightened, wincing as his back protested. Sheriff, something I can help you with? Hollis stepped inside, his boots heavy on the dirt floor. His face was troubled, which wasn't like him. The sheriff was usually unreadable as stone. Got a visit today from Tom Brennan. He's concerned about you, Eli snorted. That's charitable of him. His words, not mine. Hollis pulled out his pipe and began the ritual of filling and lighting it. Said you've been acting strange, obsessive, worried you might be... He paused, choosing words carefully. Not in your right mind. The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Eli set down his file and faced the sheriff directly. I'm opening a safe, Hollis. That's not crazy. That's just stubborn. I know that. Hollis puffed on his pipe. But Brennan's got influence. He's talking to folks, suggesting maybe someone should check on your welfare. Make sure you're fit to live on your own. The threat was clear enough. If enough people agreed Eli was losing his faculties, they could have him declared incompetent. Take away what little independence he had left. It was a cruel move, but effective. And exactly the kind of thing Brennan would do. Why? Eli asked quietly. Why does he care what I do in my own barn? Hollis was silent for a long moment, studying his pipe. When he spoke, his voice was low. I've been sheriff a long time, Mercer. Long enough to know that when a man gets nervous, there's usually a reason. Brennan came to this town 10 years back with money and no clear story about where it came from. Built himself up fast, too fast maybe. And he's always been mighty interested in anything to do with the old robbery. Eli's heart quickened. You think he knows something? I think, Hollis met his eyes, I think you should be careful. That robbery killed people, your parents included, and whoever did it was never caught. Which means they're either dead or still walking around. If it's the latter, they've had 40 years to build a life on blood money. They won't take kindly to anyone digging up the past. The sheriff's words settled over Eli like a cold blanket. He'd been so focused on opening the safe, on finding answers, that he hadn't fully considered the implications. Whoever robbed that depot had committed murder. And if that person was still alive, still here in Stillwater, they'd have every reason to want the past to stay buried. "I'll be careful," Eli said. Hollis nodded and turned to leave, but paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I hope you find what you're looking for, but watch your back. And if that safe does open and there's something inside, come to me first. Don't go playing investigator on your own." After the sheriff left, Eli stood in the silence of the barn, his mind racing. Brennan's sudden interest in stopping him, the sheriff's warning, the bullet holes in the safe that someone had put there 40 years ago, trying to get inside. It was all connecting in ways that made his skin prickle. He turned back to the safe with renewed purpose. Whatever was inside, it was important enough that someone was worried about it even now. That meant he was on the right track. That meant the answers were close. He picked up his tools again and went back to work. By the 5th day, Eli had cleared away most of the external rust and managed to expose the full lock mechanism. It was beautiful in its own way. Intricate gears and levers, all designed to keep secrets safe. He'd learned its rhythm, the way each piece related to the others. But he still couldn't make it open. Jesse arrived that evening to find Eli sitting on the ground, staring at the safe with exhausted eyes. The boy set down the dinner basket and sat beside him. "Maybe you need help," Jesse suggested quietly. "There's a locksmith in Silver Creek, 2 days' ride. He might know how to—" "No," Eli's voice was firm. "Word would spread, and I'm not sure I trust anyone else with this, not even the sheriff." Eli considered. Hollis seemed genuine in his concern. But the sheriff had also been here during the robbery, had been part of the investigation. If he'd missed something then, or worse, if he'd been paid to miss something, involving him now could be dangerous. It was an ugly thought, suspecting a man who'd always been fair. But 40 years and blood money could change anyone. "Not yet," Eli said finally. "Not until I know what we're dealing with," Jesse nodded, accepting the decision. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then the boy spoke again. "Mr. Mercer, can I ask you something? About your parents?" "You can ask. Do you remember them? Really remember, I mean, not just stories people told you." Eli closed his eyes, reaching back through the years. "Some. My mother had dark hair and she sang while she worked. My father had big hands, rough but gentle. He used to let me help in the store, stacking cans and sweeping. Made me feel important." He opened his eyes. "And I remember the night they died. Not everything, but pieces. The smell of smoke, shouting, someone carrying me away while I screamed for my mother." Jesse was quiet, his young face solemn. Finally he said, "I'm glad you remember some of it. I'm starting to forget what my mama looked like. Her face gets harder to see every day." Eli put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Write it down, son. Every memory you can catch. Write it down before it fades. That's the one thing I wish I'd done." They shared Martha's stew in the lamplight, 2 orphans bound by loss and the understanding that came with it. And later, after Jesse had gone, Eli took his own advice. He found an old ledger with blank pages in the back and began to write. Every memory of his parents, no matter how small. Every fragment of that terrible night. Every question that had haunted him. When he finally set down his pen, his hand was cramped, but his mind was clearer. Tomorrow he'd try again with the safe. And he'd keep trying until either it opened or he broke it apart. Because somewhere in that rust and iron, the truth was waiting. The morning of the 6th day brought unexpected rain, a rare blessing in this dry country. Eli stood in the barn doorway, watching water drum against the roof and turn the street to mud. The sound was peaceful, but his mind was anything but. He dreamed again last night, the same fragments that had haunted him for decades. Fire and shouting, his mother's voice calling his name, and something new this time. A man's face, bearded and hard, looking down at him through smoke. A face he couldn't quite place, but that felt familiar in a way that made his stomach turn. He was so lost in thought that he didn't hear the approach of footsteps until Martha Hayes was standing right beside him, shaking rain from her shawl. "Lord, what a morning," she said, catching her breath. I've brought you proper breakfast, Eli Mercer. Jessie says you've been eating like a bird. Martha was in her mid-50s, sturdy and practical, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. She'd run the boarding house for 20 years and had a reputation for feeding people whether they asked for it or not. She pushed past him into the barn and set a covered plate on his workbench. I appreciate it, Martha. But you didn't need to come out in the rain. Somebody needs to make sure you don't starve yourself to death over that fool's safe. She looked at the object in question, her mouth pressed in a thin line. Whole town's talking about you, you know. Half think you've lost your mind. Other half just feel sorry for you. And what about you? Martha considered the question seriously. I think you're a good man chasing something that matters to you. Whether you find it or not, well, that's between you and the good Lord. She paused. But I also think you should know Tom Brennan's been asking questions. Eli's attention sharpened. What kind of questions? About your parents. About the robbery. Went to see old Timothy Moss yesterday, asking what he remembered from back then. Timothy was just a young man in 43, but he was here. Brennan wanted to know who your father associated with, whether there'd been any trouble before the fire. A chill ran down Eli's spine. Why would he care about that? Martha shook her head. That's what troubles me. A man like Brennan, he doesn't ask questions without a reason. And he's been mighty agitated since you brought that safe home. Makes a body wonder what he's afraid of. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the rain. Finally, Martha spoke again, softer now. Your mother was a kind woman, Eli. I was just a girl then, but I remember her. She used to give me penny candy when my folks couldn't afford it. And your father, he was honest. Too honest, maybe. The kind of man who wouldn't bend, even when bending would have been easier. You think that's what got them killed? I think honesty can be dangerous when other people are trying to hide something. Martha pulled her shawl tighter. You be careful. Not just with that safe, but with who you trust. After she left, Eli ate the breakfast she'd brought, eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits that were still warm. It was the best meal he'd had in days, and he savored every bite. Then he turned back to the safe with renewed determination. If Brennan was worried, that meant Eli was close to something. He worked through the morning, trying different angles and approaches. The lock was yielding slowly, agonizingly slowly, but it was yielding. He could feel it. Each day brought him a fraction closer to understanding the mechanism, to finding the right combination of pressure and persuasion that would make it surrender its secrets. Around noon, the rain slackened to a drizzle. Eli heard voices outside and looked up to see 3 of Brennan's ranch hands walking past, leading horses toward the blacksmith. They glanced at his barn as they went, and one of them, a lean man named Cutter, said something to the others that made them laugh. They moved on, but Eli felt the weight of being watched. He stepped outside, needing air and a break from the close work. The street was nearly empty, just a few people hurrying between buildings. But there was a tension in the air, a feeling that made the hair on his neck stand up. He was being too visible, too much of a curiosity. And in a small town, being watched meant being vulnerable. He was about to go back inside when he saw Jessie running toward him, splashing through puddles with urgent purpose. The boy's face was flushed and worried. Mr. Mercer, you need to come quick. There's trouble at the store. Eli didn't hesitate. He grabbed his hat and followed Jessie at a run. When they burst into the general store, he found Billy Henderson behind the counter, his face pale and frightened. The store had been ransacked. Shelves pulled down, goods scattered across the floor, the cash box open and empty. What happened? Eli demanded. I don't know. Billy's voice shook. I was in back taking inventory. Heard a crash, came running out, but they were already gone. Took the money, nearly $40. They? Eli looked around at the destruction. This wasn't just theft. This was a message. 3 men. I only saw them from behind, running out. But Mr. Mercer... Billy hesitated. One of them, I think I recognized his walk. Might have been Cutter, one of Brennan's men. Jessie made a sound of anger. I knew it. Brennan's trying to scare us. You can't prove that, Eli said, though his mind was racing with the same conclusion. This was too convenient. The day after Martha warned him about Brennan's questions, Brennan's men just happened to rob the store where Jesse worked, where Eli got his supplies. It was intimidation, plain and simple. A way of saying, back off, or people around you will suffer. Sheriff Hollis arrived 10 minutes later, summoned by Billy. He took statements, examined the damage, and promised to investigate. But when Eli mentioned seeing Cutter and the other ranch hands nearby, Hollis's expression turned cautious. That's not evidence, Mercer. And accusing Tom Brennan's men without proof is a good way to find yourself in legal trouble. So we just let them get away with it. I didn't say that. Hollis's voice was firm. I said we need proof. I'll talk to Brennan, see if any of his men have sudden money. But in the meantime, you might want to think about whether whatever you're doing is worth putting others at risk. The words hit hard because they were partly true. Eli had been so focused on his own quest for answers that he hadn't fully considered the cost to others. Jesse, Martha, Billy, they were all vulnerable because of their connection to him. If Brennan was willing to escalate, there was no telling how far he'd go. That evening, after helping Billy clean up the store, Eli sat in his barn with a heavy heart. The safe loomed before him, still closed, still keeping its secrets. Part of him wanted to smash it open with a hammer, consequences be damned. But he knew that would destroy whatever was inside. Patience. He needed patience, but patience was getting harder to hold on to when other people were paying the price for his curiosity. 3 more days passed in a tense standoff. Sheriff Hollis questioned Brennan's men, but got nowhere. Each had alibis. Each claimed to have been working on the ranch during the robbery. The money was never recovered, and Brennan himself played the concerned citizen, publicly offering a reward for information, while privately Eli suspected laughing at them all. Eli kept working on the safe, but now he did it with the barn door barred and a loaded shotgun within reach. He'd bought the gun years ago for hunting and had barely touched it since. Now it leaned against the wall, a grim reminder that this search for truth might end in violence. Jesse still visited, though Eli had tried to discourage him. The boy was stubborn, insisting he wasn't afraid of Brennan or his men. "You're the only person who treats me like I matter," Jesse had said simply. "I'm not abandoning you just because some bully wants to scare us." That loyalty meant more to Eli than the boy probably knew. It also made him more determined to see this through. If he gave up now, it would teach Jesse that intimidation worked, that the powerful always won. And that was a lesson Eli refused to pass on. On the 9th day, since he'd brought the safe home, Eli finally felt something give. He was working with a thin piece of bent metal, probing carefully inside the lock mechanism, when he heard a distinct click. His heart nearly stopped. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, he applied gentle pressure to the tumbler he'd been working on. Another click, then another. His hands were shaking now, but he forced them steady. This was it. After days of frustration and setbacks, the lock was finally cooperating. One more tumbler, then the main lever. He could see the sequence now, understand the path he needed to follow. A sound outside made him freeze. Footsteps, multiple sets approaching the barn. His hand moved toward the shotgun, but then he heard a familiar voice. "Eli? You in there?" It was Timothy Moss, the old man who usually spent his days whittling on his bench. But he wasn't alone. Eli unbarred the door to find Timothy with 2 other old-timers, Frank Wade and Samuel Corning. They stood in the afternoon sun, 3 men well past 70, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Gentlemen," Eli said cautiously, "something I can help you with?" Timothy cleared his throat. "It's more what we can help you with. We've been talking, the 3 of us, about the robbery, about your parents, and we think you should know some things." Eli's pulse quickened. "Come in." They filed into the barn, each man's eyes going immediately to the safe. Timothy whistled low. "So that's what all the fuss is about. That's the depot safe, sure enough. I remember seeing it before the fire. You were there." Eli asked, offering them seats on crates and boxes. "We all were," Frank said. He was a stooped man with thin white hair and arthritic hands. Young men back then, working various jobs in town. Samuel here was a hostler. I worked for the freight company. And Timothy was... I was helping at your parents' trading post, Timothy finished quietly. Which is why I remember that day so clearly. Eli sat down heavily, his legs suddenly weak. Tell me. The three old men exchanged glances, as if confirming their decision one last time. Then Timothy began to speak. Your father had gotten into an argument with someone a few days before the fire. I didn't hear all of it, but it was heated. Something about a shipment that had gone missing, and your father refusing to alter the books to cover it up. Whose shipment? Eli asked, though he already suspected the answer, never got a name. But the man who came to argue was well-dressed. Had money, you could tell. And he was angry, the kind of angry that comes from fear, not just irritation. Your father stood firm, said he'd report the discrepancy to the freight company headquarters. Samuel picked up the story. 2 days later, there was talk around town about a big payroll coming through on the next stage. Money for the mining operations up north. Enough gold to make a man rich for life. And the day it arrived, Frank continued, there was a fire. Started in the depot, they said. But I was there when the flames first went up, and I can tell you, it started in multiple places at once. That wasn't accident. That was deliberate. Eli's voice was barely a whisper. My parents. Timothy's old eyes were wet. Your father tried to stop them. I saw him go into the burning building. Your mother went after him, screaming. I was trying to help, but the smoke, it was too much. Someone pulled me back. By the time the fire burned itself out, they were both gone. And so was the payroll. Who? Eli demanded. Who did it? That's the thing, Samuel said. Nobody ever knew for certain. There were suspects, drifters who'd been in town that week, rough characters. But they all had alibis or had vanished. The investigation went nowhere. And after a while, folks just moved on. Not everyone, Frank added. Some of us always wondered, especially when certain people suddenly came into money in the years that followed. The implication hung in the air. Eli's mind was racing, connecting pieces. Brennan, we don't know that, Timothy said quickly. And we're not saying it in public, you understand. We're old men with no proof and no desire to end our days in a lawsuit. But we thought you should know what we remember, Samuel finished. And we wanted to tell you, if there's something in that safe, if there's evidence of what really happened, you have our support. Quiet support, mind you. But support nonetheless. After they left, Eli sat alone with their words echoing in his head. His father had been killed for trying to do the right thing. His mother had died trying to save him. And the men responsible had walked free for 40 years, maybe even prospered. He turned back to the safe with new fire burning in his chest. This wasn't just about answers anymore. This was about justice. This was about making sure his parents' deaths meant something. He picked up his tools and went back to work. The lock was close now, so close he could practically hear the tumblers begging to turn. And somewhere deep in that iron box, he knew, the truth was waiting to be set free. As the sun set and shadows grew long, Eli worked with steady, determined hands. Click, click, click. Each sound was a step closer to vindication. Each movement brought him nearer to the moment when everything would finally make sense. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow I'll have it open. And then we'll see who's been lying all these years. Eli woke before dawn, with his heart pounding from another nightmare. This time the dream had been clearer, more memory than imagination. He saw his father standing in the trading post, facing a well-dressed man whose face remained frustratingly in shadow. Their voices were raised, angry words about truth and consequences. And then fire, everywhere fire, and his mother's hands gripping his shoulders so tight they hurt. He lay in the darkness of his small room, letting the fragments settle into place. The old men's story had unlocked something in his mind, memories he'd buried so deep he'd half convinced himself they weren't real. But they were real. All of it was real. And today, he'd prove it. The safe was waiting when he entered the barn, its battered surface catching the first rays of morning light through the gaps in the walls. Eli rolled up his sleeves and picked up where he'd left off the night before. 3 tumblers were already set. Only 2 more to go. And then the main locking bar. He worked carefully, methodically, each movement precise as a surgeon's. The metal resisted, corroded by time and weather. But he coaxed it gently. Patience. Everything came down to patience. One tumbler shifted into place with a satisfying click. His breath caught. One more. A shadow fell across the barn door. Eli's hand went instinctively toward the shotgun, but he relaxed when he saw it was only Jesse, earlier than usual. Couldn't sleep, the boy admitted, coming inside. Keep thinking about what happened at the store. About what might happen next. Nothing's going to happen to you, Jesse. I won't let it. That's not what worries me. The boy sat on a crate, his young face serious beyond his years. What worries me is what they might do to you. Mr. Mercer, maybe you should take that safe to the sheriff. Let him handle it. Can't do that, son. Why not? Eli paused in his work, considering how to explain. Because some truths are personal. Because my parents died for this, and I need to be the one who sees it through. And because, he met Jesse's eyes, because I don't know for certain who I can trust. Not yet? Jesse nodded slowly, understanding more than Eli had said. They'd both learned young that the world wasn't always as it seemed, that sometimes the people who should protect you were the ones you needed protection from. Eli returned to his work, and Jesse watched in silence. An hour passed, then another. The sun climbed higher, painting stripes of light across the barn floor. And finally, with a click that seemed to echo through the whole building, the last tumbler fell into place. Eli's hands froze. He stared at the lock, hardly believing it. After 10 days of constant effort, after years of unanswered questions, he was one step away from the truth. All that remained was to pull the locking bar free. You did it, Jesse whispered, awe in his voice. Almost. Eli gripped the main lever, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it. Everything changed after this, one way or another. He took a breath, said a silent prayer to his parents' memory, and pulled. The locking bar slid free with a screech of protesting metal. The safe door loosened in its frame, no longer held by the mechanism that had guarded it for 40 years. Eli's heart was hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. He put his hands on the door handle, ready to swing it open. Eli Mercer! The shout came from outside, loud and commanding. Brennan's voice. Eli's hand tightened on the safe door, but he didn't open it. Not yet. Not with witnesses who might destroy or steal whatever was inside. Stay here, he told Jesse. Don't touch the safe. If anything happens to me, you tell Sheriff Hollis about this. You tell him everything. Mr. Mercer, promise me, Jesse. The boy's face was pale but determined. I promise. Eli grabbed the shotgun and stepped outside. Tom Brennan stood in the street with half a dozen of his ranch hands spread out behind him. They weren't holding weapons, but the threat was clear enough in their postures and expressions. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the confrontation. Eli saw Martha Hayes, Timothy Moss, Sheriff Hollis making his way through the onlookers. You need to stop this foolishness, Mercer, Brennan called out. That safe is dangerous. Old unstable. You could hurt yourself or burn down this whole barn messing with it. That's real thoughtful of you, Tom, but I'll take my chances. Brennan's face darkened. I'm serious. You're disturbing the peace, causing problems in this town. People are worried about you. Maybe it's time someone stepped in for your own good. Is that a threat? It's a friendly warning. Brennan stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Eli could hear. You don't know what you're dealing with. Some things are better left buried. For everyone's sake. Eli met his gaze steadily. Including yours? Something flashed in Brennan's eyes. Fear, quickly masked by anger. You're making a mistake. The mistake was made 40 years ago, Eli said clearly, loud enough for the crowd to hear. When good people died and their killers walked free. I'm just setting the record straight. Sheriff Hollis finally pushed through to the front. That's enough. Brennan, you and your men clear out. Mercer's not breaking any laws, he looked at Eli, but you'd better not be either. If you've got something in that safe, I want to know about it. Official-like. You'll know soon enough, Eli promised. We all will. Brennan stared at him for a long moment, then turned sharply and strode away, his men following. But Eli saw one of them, Cutter, look back with cold eyes that promised violence. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The crowd dispersed slowly, buzzing with speculation. Martha caught Eli's eye and nodded once, a gesture of support. Timothy did the same. Hollis lingered, his expression troubled. "Whatever you're about to do, Mercer, think carefully. If you're right about what's in there, if it implicates someone powerful, you're putting yourself in real danger." "I know. And you're doing it anyway?" "I have to." Eli's voice was quiet but firm. "My parents deserve justice. Even if it's 40 years late," Hollis sighed. "Then God help you, son, because I'm not sure anyone else can." After the sheriff left, Eli returned to the barn. Jesse was still there, faithful as Clementine, waiting by the safe. Together they stood before it, before the moment of truth Eli had been working toward his entire life. "Ready?" Jesse asked. Eli nodded. He reached for the safe door, his fingers trembling slightly. This was it. Whatever lay inside would either give him the answers he'd always sought or prove that he'd been chasing ghosts all along. Either way, there was no turning back now. He pulled the door open. The safe door swung open with a groan of ancient hinges, revealing an interior darker than the surrounding barn. Eli's hands trembled as he reached for the oil lamp, bringing it closer to illuminate what 40 years had kept hidden. Jesse pressed close beside him, both of them holding their breath. The safe wasn't empty. Far from it. Inside lay a stack of papers, yellowed with age but remarkably well preserved thanks to the sealed environment. No gold, no bags of coins, just paper, letters, documents, and what looked like a leather-bound journal. Eli lifted them out carefully, his hands reverent, and spread them across his workbench. The first letter was addressed in elegant script. "To whomever finds this." "Should I fail in my duty?" Eli's breath caught. He recognized the handwriting from fragments of memory and an old family Bible. This was his father's hand. He began to read aloud, his voice shaking. "My name is James Mercer, proprietor of Mercer's Trading Post in Crossroads. If you are reading this, it means the worst has come to pass. I'm writing to expose a conspiracy of theft and murder that I have uncovered, knowing that doing so may cost me my life. For the past 6 months, shipments passing through the depot have been systematically robbed, not on the trail but here in Crossroads itself. Someone with access to the depot's schedules and storage has been stealing goods before they ever reach their destinations. The losses have been small enough to be attributed to bookkeeping errors or trail accidents, but they are deliberate and coordinated. I discovered this by accident when a freight manifest came into my hands showing goods that never reached the depot at all. When I pressed for answers, I was told to mind my own business. When I persisted, I was threatened. The threats came from a man named Thomas Bailey, a freighter who claims to work for an Eastern syndicate but whose background cannot be verified." Eli's blood ran cold. Thomas Bailey, TB. Tom Brennan's initials were TB. Could it be? He kept reading, faster now. "Bailey warned me that if I reported my findings, my family would suffer. But I cannot in good conscience remain silent. I have compiled evidence of 12 separate thefts over 6 months, totaling over $3,000 in goods. I have hidden this evidence in the depot safe, along with this letter and my detailed journal of observations. There is more. I have reason to believe Bailey plans to rob the mining payroll scheduled to arrive next week. I have heard him speaking with associates, men I cannot identify but whose voices I would recognize. They plan to stage a fire to cover the theft, to destroy records, and kill any witnesses. I pray I am wrong. I pray I am being overly cautious. But if I am right, and if this letter is found, please know, Thomas Bailey is a murderer and a thief. He must be brought to justice for my family's sake and for all the good people who have been victimized by his crimes." The letter was dated 3 days before the fire, 3 days before Eli's parents died. His vision blurred with tears, but he forced himself to keep reading. The journal beneath the letter contained meticulous notes, dates, times, descriptions of stolen goods, and most damning of all, a sketch. A careful drawing of a man's face, labeled Thomas Bailey, age approximately 35. Eli held the sketch to the lamplight, his hands shaking so badly he could barely keep it steady. The face was younger, the beard thicker, but the features were unmistakable. Heavy brows, a strong jaw, cold eyes that looked right through you. It was Tom Brennan, 40 years younger, but undeniably the same man. "Dear God," Jesse whispered. "It's him. It's really him." But there was more. Beneath the journal lay another document, an official-looking certificate with an ornate border and faded ink. Eli unfolded it carefully, and his heart nearly stopped. It was a death certificate for Thomas Bailey, dated 1845, 2 years after the robbery. Cause of death, shooting. Location, Silver Creek. The signature at the bottom was from a doctor Eli had never heard of. But there was a notation in the margin, in different handwriting: body never recovered. Suspect fled. He faked his own death, Eli said, the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. Bailey robbed the depot, killed anyone who could identify him, and then disappeared. He let everyone think he died, and came back years later as Tom Brennan. Same man, new name. Jesse's face was white. But how did he get away with it? Someone should have recognized him. He was only in town a few months before the robbery. And he came back 10 years later, older, richer, with papers that said he was from back east. People's memories fade. And anyone who might have remembered, Eli's blood turned to ice. The old-timers who'd visited him. Timothy, Frank, Samuel. They'd been there. They would have seen Bailey. Did they recognize Brennan? Or had 40 years and a different name been enough to fool even them? There was one more item in the safe, a small leather pouch. Eli opened it and gasped. Gold coins, 20 of them, gleaming despite the years. A tiny fraction of what must have been stolen, but enough to prove his father had been telling the truth. Enough to prove the robbery had happened exactly as the letter described. Eli sank onto a crate, overwhelmed by the weight of what he'd discovered. His father hadn't just died in an accident. He'd been murdered for trying to do the right thing, for trying to expose a criminal. And that criminal had lived free for 40 years, had prospered, had bought up half the county with blood money, including the ranch that had been Eli's. A new thought struck him like a physical blow. His own ranch failing, the drought that came at just the wrong time, the bank calling in loans early, had any of it been natural? Or had Brennan been manipulating events, making sure Eli ended up with nothing? Making sure the son of James Mercer was broken and discredited, just another poor fool whose word meant nothing? What do we do? Jesse's voice was small, frightened. Eli looked at the boy, then at the evidence spread before them. His father's words, preserved all these years, waiting for someone to find them, waiting for justice. "We take this to Sheriff Hollis," Eli said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "Every word, every document, every coin, we give him everything and we make him listen. What if he doesn't believe us?" "He'll believe this." Eli held up the sketch, the death certificate, the journal. "This is proof, real documented proof. Even Brennan can't talk his way out of this." But even as he said the words, doubt crept in. Brennan was powerful, connected, wealthy. He'd spent decades building his reputation. Would anyone really believe that he was actually a murderer and thief from 40 years ago? Would they want to believe it? And more importantly, what would Brennan do when he found out his secret was no longer safe? The answer came sooner than Eli expected. From outside, there was a shout, then the sound of running feet. Jesse ran to the door and looked out, then turned back with terror on his face. "Mr. Mercer, there's smoke coming from the boarding house. And the general store. They're both on fire!" History, it seemed, was about to repeat itself. And this time, Eli was determined to make sure it ended differently. Eli's instincts kicked in before his mind fully processed what was happening. He grabbed the journal, the letters, and the death certificate, shoving them into a canvas bag he used for supplies. The gold coins went in last, heavy and damning. Then he thrust the bag at Jesse. "Take Clementine. Ride to the sheriff's office. Don't stop for anything. Give this to Hollis and tell him everything." He gripped the boy's shoulders. "Everything, you understand? Tell him it's Brennan. Tell him about the evidence. And tell him to send help. But I'm going to help with the fires. Go, Jesse, now!" The boy ran, and Eli heard the sound of Clementine's hooves moments later, fading into the chaos outside. He grabbed 2 empty buckets and rushed into the street. The scene before him was nightmare made real. Martha's boarding house was burning on the east side of Main Street, flames already climbing to the 2nd floor. The general store, 2 buildings down, had smoke pouring from its windows. People were running in all directions, some toward the fires with buckets, others away from them with whatever possessions they could carry. And through the smoke and confusion, Eli saw Brennan's men. Cutter and 2 others, standing near the alley between buildings, watching with cold satisfaction. Not helping, not alarmed, just watching, because they'd set the fires. Of course they had, just like Bailey had set the depot fire 40 years ago, to destroy evidence and create chaos. But this time, the evidence was already gone. This time, Eli had been ready. He ran to the town well, filled his buckets, and joined the bucket brigade forming outside the boarding house. Martha was there, her face streaked with soot, tears running down her cheeks as she watched her life's work burn. The upstairs. She screamed at the men trying to organize the firefighting effort. "Mrs. Patterson is up there. She can't walk well. She'll never make it down." Eli didn't hesitate. He dropped his buckets and ran for the boarding house entrance. Someone grabbed his arm. "Billy Henderson, you can't go in there. The stairs are already burning." "Then I'll find another way." Eli shook him off and circled the building, looking for options. There, a ladder used for roof repairs lying against the side wall. He grabbed it, hauled it upright, and leaned it against the 2nd-floor gallery that wrapped around the building. The wood was already hot, already beginning to catch, but it might hold long enough. He climbed fast, the heat hitting him like a physical force. Smoke poured through a broken window, making his eyes water and his lungs burn. He pulled his shirt up over his mouth and nose, crawled through the window into what had been Martha's storage room. The air inside was thick with smoke, the floor already uncomfortably hot beneath his hands and knees. "Mrs. Patterson!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Where are you?" A weak cough answered him from down the hallway. Eli crawled toward it, staying low where the air was slightly clearer. He found her in her room, collapsed beside her bed, overcome by smoke. She was an elderly woman, tiny and frail, but conscious enough to grip his arm when he reached her. "Can't breathe. I've got you." Eli hauled her onto his back, feeling the heat of the floor through his trousers now. The building was going fast, much faster than it should. This wasn't a natural fire. This was accelerated, deliberate. They'd used something to make sure it would spread quickly. The journey back to the window felt like miles. The smoke was so thick now, he could barely see, could barely think. His lungs screamed for air. His eyes burned. But he kept moving, kept crawling, kept thinking about his mother running into burning building to save his father. He understood now. Understood the desperate courage it took to run toward fire instead of away from it. He made it to the window, gasping, and hands reached up from below. Men on the ladder, ready to help. They took Mrs. Patterson from him, passed her down carefully. Then they grabbed Eli, pulling him out just as the floor behind him collapsed with a roar of flames and falling timber. He descended the ladder on shaking legs, took 3 steps and collapsed to his knees, coughing violently. Someone, Timothy Moss, pressed a dipper of water into his hands. He drank, coughed, drank again. "The store," he gasped. "Is anyone—" "Billy got everyone out," Timothy said. "Building's a loss, but no one died." Eli looked up at the boarding house, now fully engulfed. Martha stood nearby, supported by other women, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Everything she owned was gone, and it was Eli's fault. Brennan had done this because of him, because of what he'd found, but it was Brennan's fault first. Brennan had started this 40 years ago when he murdered innocent people for money. Everything since then, every crime, every victim, flowed from that original sin. Eli struggled to his feet, his body aching but his resolve hardening into something unbreakable. He scanned the crowd until he found what he was looking for, Cutter and the other 2 ranch hands, still standing in the shadows, still watching. Their eyes met his across the chaos, and he saw the message in them. "Back off, or next time it'll be your barn. Next time you won't be so lucky." But they'd made a mistake. They'd assumed Eli would break, would give up, would hand over the evidence to save innocent people from more harm. They didn't understand that some things mattered more than safety. They didn't understand that justice delayed was still justice, and that 40 years of silence was 40 years too long. Sheriff Hollis appeared through the smoke, his face grim. Jesse was with him, still clutching the canvas bag. The boy ran to Eli, relief flooding his features. "Thank God you're alive." "I thought, when I saw the fires, I'm fine." Eli turned to Hollis. "Did he show you?" The sheriff's face was stone. "He showed me. We need to talk, privately." They moved away from the crowd, into the alley beside the blacksmith's shop. Hollis set the canvas bag on a barrel and pulled out the journal, the letters, the death certificate. His hands were steady, but his eyes were troubled. "This is, if it's real, this is explosive, Mercer. It's real. You know it is. Look at the handwriting. Look at the sketch. That's Brennan. That's Bailey. I see the resemblance," Hollis admitted. "And God help me, it makes a terrible kind of sense. But proving it, proving that a man who died 40 years ago is actually alive and living here under a false name. I'm not dead." They spun around. Tom Brennan stepped out of the shadows at the alley's mouth, and he wasn't alone. Cutter and 4 other men flanked him, and all of them were armed. Brennan himself held a pistol, pointed casually but unmistakably at Hollis. "I'm going to need you to hand over that bag, Sheriff. And then you're going to forget you ever saw what's inside it." Hollis's hand moved toward his own gun, but Cutter cocked his rifle. "I wouldn't, Sheriff. Not unless you want this to get messier than it needs to be." Eli's mind raced. They were trapped. The alley had only one exit, and Brennan's men blocked it. Jesse was pressed against the wall, his face white with fear. The canvas bag with all the evidence sat on the barrel between them and Brennan, impossibly far away, but tantalizingly close. "It's over, Bailey," Eli said quietly. "People know. I made copies. I told others." "You can't kill all of us." Brennan's smile was cold. "You're bluffing. If you'd made copies, you'd have spread them already." "No, that's the only evidence, right there in that bag. And once it's gone, it's your word against mine. A respected rancher versus a broken-down cowboy who's been acting crazy for weeks. Who do you think people will believe?" He had a point. A terrible logical point. Without the physical evidence, who would believe such a wild story? The sketch could be dismissed as resemblance. The journal could be called forgery. The death certificate proved Bailey died, not that Brennan was him. Eli's father's letter was compelling, but it was also 40 years old, and dead men couldn't testify. "You killed my parents," Eli said, his voice breaking. "You took everything from me, twice. Your father should have minded his own business." Brennan's face was hard, devoid of remorse. "He made his choice, and now you're making yours. The question is whether you'll be smart enough to live through it." Hollis spoke up, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at him. "You won't get away with this, Brennan. There are witnesses. Half the town saw your men watching those fires. People will talk. People will believe what I tell them to believe. I own this town, Sheriff. I own the bank, half the businesses, most of the ranch land. You think anyone will stand against me? Even if they believe Mercer's crazy story, which they won't, they'll be too afraid to say so." He was probably right. Money and fear were powerful silencers. But standing there, looking at the man who'd murdered his parents and destroyed his life, Eli made a decision. He wasn't going to be silent anymore. He wasn't going to let fear win. "Jesse," he said quietly, "when I move, you run. Run and scream and don't stop until you find help. Mr. Mercer, do it!" And then Eli lunged, not at Brennan, but at the barrel. His hand closed around the canvas bag, just as gunfire erupted in the narrow space, deafening and deadly. The world exploded into chaos and noise. Eli hit the ground hard, rolling, clutching the canvas bag to his chest as bullets sparked off the brick wall behind him. He heard Hollis shout, heard Jesse scream, heard the thunderous boom of the sheriff's revolver answering Brennan's men. Smoke filled the alley, not from fire this time, but from gunpowder. Through the haze, Eli saw Hollis dive behind a water trough, returning fire with quick, precise shots. One of Brennan's men went down, clutching his shoulder. Another ducked back around the corner. But Cutter stood his ground, his rifle tracking toward where Jesse huddled against the wall. "No!" Eli threw himself forward, putting his body between the rifle and the boy. The shot never came. Instead, Timothy Moss appeared behind Cutter like a ghost, swinging a heavy piece of timber. It connected with a sickening crack, and Cutter dropped. Suddenly the alley was filling with people. Frank and Samuel armed with whatever they could grab. Martha Hayes with a cast-iron skillet. Billy Henderson with a shotgun. The old-timers hadn't abandoned Eli. They'd been watching, waiting, and when the shooting started, they'd come running. Brennan's remaining men, outnumbered now and facing armed townspeople, broke and ran, all except Brennan himself. He stood in the middle of the alley, his pistol still raised, his face twisted with fury and something else, fear. The fear of a man who'd lived 40 years under a false name, who'd built an empire on blood money, and who was watching it all crumble. "It's over." "Bailey," Sheriff Hollis said, stepping forward with his gun trained steady. "Put down the weapon. It's not over." Brennan's voice was raw. "It's never over. You think you've won? You think this changes anything? I built this town. I brought prosperity here. Without me, Stillwater would still be a dusty crossroads going nowhere." "You built it on murder," Eli said, getting to his feet. His ribs hurt where he'd hit the ground, but he was alive. Jesse was alive. The evidence was still clutched in his hands, stained now with the dust and blood of the alley floor, but intact. "You killed my parents. You killed innocent people. For what, money?" "For everything!" Brennan's face was flushed, his control cracking. "You think I was going to stay a two-bit freighter forever? I saw an opportunity. Your father was going to ruin it, so yes, I dealt with him. I dealt with everyone who got in my way. That's what survivors do, Mercer. They do what's necessary." "Necessary?" Eli's voice shook with rage. "My mother died in that fire. She went in trying to save my father and she died screaming. Was that necessary?" For just a moment, something flickered across Brennan's face. Regret, maybe, or just the memory of his own humanity. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "Collateral damage. I didn't want anyone to die. But your father wouldn't listen." "He wouldn't. Drop the gun, Brennan." Hollis's voice cut through the excuses like steel. "I won't ask again." Brennan's hand tightened on the pistol. For a long, terrible moment, Eli thought he might actually do it. Might go down shooting rather than face justice. But then his shoulders sagged. The gun clattered to the ground, and Thomas Bailey, murderer and thief, finally surrendered after 40 years of running. Hollis moved forward quickly, kicking the gun away and pulling Brennan's arms behind his back. Metal cuffs clicked into place, a sound that seemed to echo through the alley, through the years. All the way back to that night in 1843, when justice should have been served but wasn't. "Thomas Bailey," Hollis said formally, "you're under arrest for murder, robbery, and arson, both 40 years ago and today." Brennan Bailey laughed, a bitter sound. "You'll never make it stick. I have lawyers. I have money. I have friends in high places." "You had those things," Hollis corrected. "Right up until you decided to burn down half the town to cover your tracks. Funny thing about witnesses, they talk. And funny thing about attempted murder, judges tend to take it seriously." As Hollis led Brennan away, the gathering crowd parted. Some looked shocked. Others looked angry. A few looked vindicated, as if they'd always suspected something wasn't right about the wealthy rancher who'd appeared from nowhere with pockets full of money. Eli stood in the alley, still holding the canvas bag, watching the man who'd killed his parents finally face consequences. He should have felt triumphant. He should have felt satisfied. Instead, he just felt tired, bone-deep tired, like he'd been carrying a weight for 40 years and had only just now been allowed to set it down. Jesse appeared at his elbow, his young face serious. "You did it, Mr. Mercer. You got him." "We did it," Eli corrected gently. "Couldn't have done it without you, son." He looked around at the others. Timothy, Frank, Samuel, Martha, Billy, all the people who'd stood with him when it mattered. "Without all of you," Martha stepped forward and without a word pulled Eli into a fierce hug. She smelled like smoke and ash and laundry soap, and for just a moment Eli let himself lean into her strength. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. Your parents would be proud, she said simply. They died trying to do the right thing, and you finished what they started. Eli nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He looked down at the canvas bag in his hands, at the evidence that had finally, after 40 years, told the truth. His father's words, his father's courage, preserved all this time, waiting for someone to find them, waiting for someone to care enough to dig through the ruins and uncover what had been hidden. He'd done it. He'd found the truth. He'd brought his parents' killer to justice. The hours that followed felt both endless and impossibly fast. Sheriff Hollis locked Brennan Bailey in the town's small jail, posting guards outside in case any of his remaining loyal men tried something foolish. Most of them, it turned out, weren't feeling particularly loyal once they understood what they'd been working for. A murderer was one thing. A murderer who'd lived a lie for 40 years and dragged them into attempted murder to cover it up was quite another. Eli sat in the sheriff's office. The canvas bag's contents spread across the desk, while Hollis methodically documented everything. The journal, the letters, the death certificate, the sketch, even the gold coins, which would eventually be returned to whatever remained of the mining company that had owned them 4 decades ago. This is going to cause quite a stir, Hollis said, writing carefully in his official ledger. Federal marshals will want to be involved. This crosses state lines. Bailey's death certificate is from Silver Creek, which means he committed fraud in multiple jurisdictions. And then there's the original robbery, the murders, 40 years of living under a false identity. He shook his head. Never seen anything like it in my 30 years wearing this badge. What happens to his property? Eli asked. The question felt mercenary, but he had to know. The ranch. The businesses he owned, Hollis met his eyes. That'll be for the courts to sort out. But typically, when a man's identity is proved fraudulent, his contracts and purchases become void. Everything would revert to previous owners or their heirs. He paused meaningfully. Your ranch, for instance, the one he bought from you? If Bailey never legally existed as Brennan, then that sale might not be legally valid. The implication hung in the air. Eli could get his land back, could rebuild what he'd lost, could reclaim the life that had been stolen from him, not once, but twice. It should have filled him with hope. Instead, he just felt hollow, empty, like he'd been running toward something for so long that now, having reached it, he didn't know what to do with himself. I need to check on Martha, he said, standing. Make sure she and Mrs. Patterson have somewhere to stay. Already taken care of, Hollis said.
Frank Wade's putting them up at his place.
And the town council's called an emergency meeting for tomorrow to discuss rebuilding. Seems folks feel guilty about how they treated you, Mercer. About doubting you. Eli nodded and headed for the door, but Hollis called after him. Eli, you did a good thing here. A brave thing. Don't let the weight of it crush you. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of orange and purple. The boarding house and general store were just charred skeletons now, still smoldering. The smell of burned wood hung thick over everything, but people were already organizing, already planning. That was the thing about small towns. They knew how to survive, how to rebuild, how to keep going even when everything seemed lost. Jesse found Eli, standing in the street, staring at the ruins. The boy didn't say anything, just stood beside him in companionable silence. After a while, Eli spoke. I thought I'd feel different. When it was finally over, I mean. I thought I'd feel, I don't know, complete maybe, or satisfied, but you don't? I feel sad. For my parents, for all the years we lost, for all the people who got hurt along the way. He looked at Jesse. Your parents, Martha, Billy, even Mrs. Patterson, she could have died today, all because I needed answers. Jesse was quiet for a moment, thinking with that serious way he had. Mr. Mercer, if you hadn't found those answers, Brennan, Bailey, would have kept getting away with it. He would have kept hurting people. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually. But men don't stop being bad just because nobody's watching. Out of the mouths of children, Eli thought. Or in this case, out of the mouth of a 14-year-old who'd already seen more of life's darkness than he should have. But Jesse was right. Justice mattered. Truth mattered. even when, especially when, pursuing them came at a cost. Timothy Moss approached, leaning heavily on his cane. Behind him came Frank and Samuel, moving with the careful steps of old men who'd had a long, difficult day. They formed a small circle there in the street, 4 generations of orphans and truth-seekers. "Town's talking," Timothy said without preamble, "about what you did, about what Bailey did. And we wanted you to know, we remember now. Frank, Samuel and me, we looked at that sketch again, really looked, and we remember Thomas Bailey. Young fellow cocky, always had money to flash around. We should have recognized him when he came back as Brennan. Should have seen through the different name and the fancy clothes. Don't blame yourselves," Eli said. 10 years is a long time, and he was careful. Probably changed his appearance deliberately, grew the beard different, gained weight, changed his mannerisms. He knew people might remember. "Still," Frank said gruffly, "we should have been more observant. Should have questioned where all that money came from. You're questioning now," Eli pointed out. "That's what matters." They stood together as darkness fell, watching lamplight begin to glow in windows throughout the town. Somewhere in the distance, someone was playing a fiddle, a mournful tune that matched the mood. Life going on as it always did, even in the shadow of tragedy and revelation. "What'll you do now?" Samuel asked Eli. "If you get your ranch back?" Eli thought about it. The ranch. His old life. Everything he'd lost, and everything he might regain. It should have been an easy answer. But he found himself looking at Jesse, at the boy who'd stood by him through everything, at the old-timers who'd finally spoken up, at the ruins of Martha's boarding house and Billy's store. "First," he said slowly, "I'm going to help rebuild. The boarding house, the store. This town took care of me when I had nothing. Time I returned the favor, and after," Timothy pressed, "after," Eli smiled, small but genuine. "After, I think I'll find out what it's like to have a family again. Even if that family looks a little different than what I started with." Jesse's face lit up with understanding and hope. The old-timers nodded their approval. And for the first time since he'd opened that safe and discovered the truth, Eli felt something other than emptiness. He felt purpose. Not the driven, desperate purpose that had sustained him through years of searching, but something gentler. The purpose of building instead of chasing, of nurturing instead of pursuing, of being present instead of haunted. 3 months later, Eli stood in the doorway of what had once been his ranch house, watching the sun rise over land that was, impossibly, his again. The courts had moved faster than anyone expected. Bailey's fraudulent identity had been so thoroughly documented in Eli's father's papers that the judge had little choice but to void every contract and sale made under the name Thomas Brennan. The ranch, along with most of Bailey's other holdings, had reverted to their previous owners or been seized by the government to compensate victims of the original robbery. The house needed work. 40 years of different ownership had changed it. Walls knocked down, rooms added, the barn expanded. But the bones were the same. The foundation his father had laid. The view his mother had loved, looking out over the valley where Clementine now grazed peacefully. Coming home, Eli had discovered, was more complicated than he'd imagined. Every room held ghosts, some painful, some precious, but he wasn't alone in facing them. Jesse lived here now, officially. The adoption papers had been filed last week, making legal what had been true in their hearts for months. The boy was his son in all the ways that mattered, not by blood, but by choice and love and shared understanding of what it meant to lose everything and find it again. "Breakfast is ready," Jesse called from the kitchen. The boy had taken to cooking with surprising enthusiasm, learning from Martha, who visited twice a week to check on them, and, Eli suspected, to mother them both, whether they needed it or not. They ate together at the old wooden table, eggs, bacon, biscuits that Jesse had somehow learned to make almost as good as Martha's. Through the window, Eli could see Timothy Moss and Frank Wade approaching on horseback, coming to help with the day's work. The old-timers had made themselves useful advisors in getting the ranch operational again, their memories of how things used to be run proving invaluable. "Got a letter from the territorial governor yesterday," Eli mentioned between bites. "They want to talk about the reward for solving the Bailey case. Apparently, there's still money set aside from the original robbery investigation. Jesse's eyes widened. How much? Enough to rebuild the boarding house and the general store properly, with some left over. Eli smiled at the boy's expression. I'm thinking we split it. Part for us, part for Martha and Billy, part for the town improvement fund. Seems fair. More than fair, Jesse said quietly. You didn't have to share it at all. Money that comes from tragedy should go toward healing. That's what your grandmother, my mother, would have said. She believed in community, in taking care of each other. Eli paused, the memory no longer quite so painful. I like to think she'd be happy seeing us do the same. After breakfast, they worked together, repairing fence lines that had fallen into disrepair. It was good, honest work, the kind that made your back ache and your hands rough, but left your mind clear. Clementine followed along, occasionally offering commentary in the form of brays and snorts. She'd earned her retirement from hauling scrap, but she seemed to enjoy the company too much to just stay in the barn. Around noon, a rider appeared on the road, Sheriff Hollis, his horse kicking up dust as he approached. Eli straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. Visits from the sheriff still made him nervous, probably always would after everything that had happened. Eli, Jesse, Hollis greeted them, dismounting. Got news! Bailey's trial date is set. 3 months from now in the territorial capital. They'll want you to testify, Mercer. You and everyone else who was there when he confessed. I'll be there, Eli said without hesitation. He'd face Bailey one more time, tell the court what the man had done, and then finally let it go. Let the law handle it from here. Hollis nodded, then his expression softened. Also wanted to tell you, we found the rest of it. The payroll money. Bailey had it hidden in a false cellar under his house. Most of it, anyway. What he hadn't spent over the years. How much? Near about $18,000. With interest and appreciation, the territory's calculating it's worth closer to $50,000 in today's money. Hollis smiled. That's going to the victims' families, including yours. You'll be a wealthy man, Mercer. Eli absorbed this information slowly. Wealthy. He'd been wealthy once, and it hadn't protected him from loss. Money didn't solve problems, didn't bring back the dead, didn't erase 40 years of questions and pain. But it could do something. It could provide security, could give Jesse opportunities, could help rebuild not just buildings, but lives. Thank you for letting me know, he said finally. After Hollis left, Eli and Jesse stood together looking out over the ranch, over the land that had been lost and found again. The wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Somewhere a hawk cried out. Life continued as it always had, as it always would. Do you still think about them? Jesse asked quietly. Your parents? Every day, Eli admitted. But it's different now. Before, thinking about them meant thinking about how they died, about the questions I couldn't answer. Now I can think about how they lived, about the choices they made, the courage they showed, about how they passed that on to me, even though I didn't realize it for the longest time. Jesse nodded, understanding. I think about my parents that way too now. Not just the fever that took them, but the stories, the memories, the way my mama sang, the way my father laughed. They stood in comfortable silence, two orphans who'd found each other, who'd found justice, who'd found, finally, a way to honor the past while building a future. The rusty safe that had started it all sat in the house now, cleaned and polished, holding nothing but the original documents that had vindicated James Mercer's courage and exposed Thomas Bailey's crimes. It was a memorial now, a reminder, a promise kept. Come on, Eli said, clapping Jesse on the shoulder. We've got fence to mend before supper. And Martha's bringing pie tonight. We don't want to give her any reason to lecture us about working too hard. Jesse laughed, the sound bright and young and full of hope. They returned to their work, father and son in all but blood, building something together on land reclaimed and hearts finally at peace. The world had thrown away a rusty safe 40 years ago, dismissing it as worthless. But inside, it had held something more valuable than gold, truth, courage, and a father's love that survived even death. Eli had found all three, and in finding them, He'd found himself sometimes, he thought, as he drove another fence post into the good earth, sometimes what the world considers garbage is actually treasure. You just have to be willing to dig through the rust and time and pain to find it. You just have to believe it's worth searching for, and in his case, it had been worth everything.